Good evening. It is indeed an honor to welcome Ambassador Andrew Young to Westchester University. Ambassador Young brings with him a lifetime of dedication and service to public policy and government. But even beyond that, he brings a commitment to teach and reach out to students at universities like ours. Philosopher John Ruskin explains education is leading human souls to what is best and making what is best out of them. In the variety of roles Andrew Young has performed, in 1961, being a leader in the Southern Christian Leadership Organization, in 1972, winning a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, in 1977, the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, and in 1981, winning 2 terms as the mayor of Atlanta. Andrew Young has indeed become and embedified this quotation of leading human souls to what is excellent and what is good. As chair of the Atlanta Committee of the 1996 Summer Olympic Games, Andrew Young is again putting Atlanta into international prominence. The Olympics test not only the physical endurance of athletes, but it also tests the values, aspirations, and endurance and accomplishments of nations. Ambassador Young typifies the best of what our nation represents in his professional and political commitment to the citizens of the United States. Let us welcome Ambassador Andrew Young to Westchester University.
Thank you very much. This has been a very good day for me. It was a good trip up, had an excellent dinner. That was a wonderful introduction. All I have to do is make a great speech and you be a great audience. I think we won't have any problem with the latter. Let me see if I can share with you some of my memories and meanings that go back some 27 years ago this day. I didn't think I was very young, and I probably really wasn't very young, but it was a very playful day. I had spent the day in Memphis in a federal court, and I'd been on the witness stand all day long because we were attempting to demonstrate and march with the workers of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. And we had been denied an opportunity to walk with them as they attempted to help the sanitation workers of the city of Memphis, Tennessee, just gain the right to collectively bargain. And it seemed as though the courts were going to decide in our favor, and I had been a party of one of the classic cases, Young versus Davis down in Florida, where the Klan had stopped us from marching and beaten everybody up and thrown us in jail. But the federal court stood up for our right to peacefully protest, and that was the week or so before the 1964 Civil Rights Acts was passed into law. And we felt like we had very good precedent and a very good judge. So everybody was very, very ecstatic almost, except that I had not talked to Martin Luther King all day long. And when I came back to the Lorraine Motel, he was worried because he didn't know how the court case had been going on. And he started playfully fussing with me about how to stay in touch with him, and that he had to know what was going on, and I was pleading that I was on the witness stand and I didn't care who he was. I couldn't get off the judge's witness stand to come and call him. He picked up a pillow off the bed and he hauled off and he whapped me side my head with it. And then everybody else in this hotel room with 2 double beds and 3 pillows, everybody seemed to pick up pillows, and we had just a wildcat pillow fight. These were the leaders of your nation. As A. Philip Randolph introduced him, the moral leader of the 20th century. But he was being a playful child, a happy young man who really believed in this country and who had devoted his life to helping America to live out the true meaning of her creeds. And it was very simple for him that America was the greatest nation on the face of the earth in the history of humankind, and yet America had not learned to deal with racism. America had not learned to deal with war, and America had not learned to deal with poverty. And he and the ministers of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference determined that we had to be involved in helping to redeem the soul of America, helping America to really and truly overcome the difficulties of our racist heritage, learn to get along with the nations of the rest of the world without destroying either person or property, and learn to deal with the needs and the problems of the least of these God's children, whatever their race or creed may be. On the way to Washington to appeal to the Congress of the United States in behalf of the poor, Memphis was just a stop by the wayside. And yet here were men who were working every day very hard for wages that were below the poverty line, and they simply wanted the right to organize, to bargain collectively for their best interests. Martin felt as though he had to take time off from organizing the nation's poor to go to serve the nation's poor. Most of us did not want him to go to Memphis, and we didn't go with him. In fact, he sent me on to Washington, and he and Reverend Bernard Lee went to Memphis alone. That was probably a big mistake, because even though there were well-trained nonviolent marchers, and even though the Union was very well organized and all of their national staff were there were a group of young men who had been, we found later, employed by our nation's Federal Bureau of Investigation to disrupt the march. They were paid to break windows, to stir up violence. And this was something that we usually anticipated and had enough staff there in support of Martin Luther King to prevent. But because he was going just for this one day, we didn't make the normal preparations. And we really didn't understand how terribly threatened America was by the notion that Martin Luther King was going to organize the poor to confront poverty. When we talked about the poor, we weren't talking about black poor. And we really weren't talking about a plan that we had dreamed up. We were visited by Marion Wright Edelman and 4 men from Mississippi who were in their 40s and who had never had jobs. They had worked as children in the fields, as day laborers picking cotton and chopping cotton. But the government was paying the farmers not to grow cotton and not to grow food. And so they had no work for most of their adult lives. And they came to appeal to us to help them to develop an economy that could train them and employ them so that they would no longer simply be poor, living on the charity and the benevolence of their relatives and of the state, meager though that was. That was the origin of the Poor People's Campaign. It included Cesar Chavez and Mexican farm workers. It included Appalachian white workers. It included people from the coal mines of West Virginia. It included the unemployed from the major cities of the North. And it included Native Americans or American Indians from the reservations of our land. We knew that we could not succeed. We had little or no hope for the Congress in the last session before an election enacting major poverty legislation. But we remembered that the bonus marchers that marched on Washington in the Depression, that were incidentally run out of Washington by General Douglas MacArthur, we knew that they laid the moral foundation on which Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt built the New Deal. And so we were really going simply to state our case, not hoping to succeed, but making a moral appeal to the nation that just as in Abraham Lincoln's time, a nation could not survive half slave and half free, that in this day and age, the poor of America could not survive, and America could not survive with the poor on an island of poverty in the midst of an ocean of material wealth. But that disturbed a lot of people. That disturbed people more than we imagined. And looking back on the editorials of that time and reading the statements of some of the men and women, no, not many women, but men who were in the Congress of the United States during those times, there was sheer panic that we, along with Martin Luther King, would tie up the nation's capital as we had tied up Birmingham and Selma and Montgomery. Indeed, we intended to do so and knew how to do it and planned to do it, but only to demonstrate to the nation that this nonviolent tie-up was only a precursor to greater problems that would occur if there were no response. Martin said just a year before in his speech on Vietnam that the bombs you drop on Vietnam will explode at home in unemployment and inflation. He understood the relationship between America's military involvement and America's domestic necessities in the struggle as to whether or not we could have guns and butter. Martin claimed that came down clearly on the side of butter. That was before we knew about cholesterol. But it was clear to us then that the spending priorities of our nation were not meeting the educational needs of our nation, were not meeting the health care needs of our nation, were not meeting the needs of urban infrastructure and policy to deal with the problems of cities. And the Poor People's Campaign was an attempt to force America to understand poverty. America is still trying to understand poverty and learn how to deal with it. In large measure because after that pillow fight, Martin Luther King went up to his hotel room to put on a shirt and tie because we were going out to dinner. And while we were waiting for him to get dressed on a cool evening just like this one, a shot rang out. And he had been playing and clowning so much. When I saw him disappear from the balcony, my first instinct was he's clowning again. And I thought that he had faked an accident because it sounded like an automobile backfiring or a firecracker. And it wasn't until I ran up the steps at the Lorraine Motel that I realized that the bullet that had hit him directly in his chin and tore half of his neck off. And he probably never heard the sound or felt the pain. It hit him so hard it knocked him out of his shoes. And he lay there in an amazing state of peace and tranquility. And I frankly envied him, because I didn't know how America would make it without him. There was nobody that had his moral authority. There was nobody that could attract the attention of the people of the world. There was nobody that worked as hard and devoted themselves so totally to redeeming the soul of America as had Martin Luther King, Jr. And yet there he lay in a pool of his own blood. And I said, this is a dark day for America. I don't know how we're going to make it from here. Obviously, we've made it. 27 years later and many, many victories later, we find ourselves celebrating a world that is relatively at peace in terms of international conflict, a world that has certainly overcome the barriers of East and West, a nation that has legally overcome all of the distinctions of race and creed, but a nation that still flounders when it attempts to deal with its poor. For nowadays, it seems as though rather than assuming that the government has some responsibility for maintaining a free and fair economic, socio-political order, there is an attempt to disengage from any moral responsibility and throw individuals back on their own resources. Martin Luther King would say that it's a cruel jest to say to a man with no shoes that you've got to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's an even more cruel jest for people who have lived all of their lives on government handouts, all of a sudden saying the government does not have the obligation or the money to hand out education anymore, or to provide for health care. We've built the highways, we've subsidized the agriculture, and many of the problems that Martin talked about then in relationship to the poor were a result of poor people who were made poor by government policy. Slavery was a government policy. Segregation was a government policy. It was a government policy that paid the landowners and did not provide any resources for those men and women who had been sharecroppers and day laborers when there was no more cotton to pick and no more vegetables to gather from the field. And so those people flooded to our cities as a result of bad government policy. And they came ill-educated because a segregated education system did not spend even minimal amounts on their education. But that was not just true in the South. When I was in Chicago with Martin Luther King in 1966 and 67, in the black schools of Chicago, they were spending about $230 a year on each child's education. In the schools on the near north side of Chicago, the white middle-class schools, they were spending about $500 a year on each child's education. In the suburbs of Winnetka and where's Northwestern, wherever it is, they were spending $800 and $900 a year on each child's education. And what we have is not a result of merit or ability. What we have in the way of a hierarchy in this nation is simply an accident of birth. And if you were born in certain neighborhoods and in certain parts of the country, you have certain blessings automatically conferred to you, just as you have certain blessings if you were born with a certain color of skin. And yet our nation said that we were going to resolve those difficulties, and we were going to provide a nation with a level playing field. And that level playing field was educational opportunity. And we were going to give all of God's children an opportunity to climb the ladder of success through equal educational opportunity, equal employment opportunity. And those were the kinds of values that Martin Luther King attempted to hold our nation to. But those are values that are slipping away from us. And there's no moral voice that says, as Hubert Humphrey used to say, if you think education is expensive, you ought to check out the cost of ignorance. And basically that's what's happening. Education has become too expensive. You might not be able to do it here, but in Georgia you can get a college education for $5,000 a year from a good state university. It costs $25,000 a year to keep you in Reedsville Penitentiary. And for a family of four with all of the comprehensive welfare benefits, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000. And when you add the complications of future generations of welfare, it's even greater and more costly. And yet everybody that we send through college, no matter how poor a student we are, and I was one of the poorest students in every school I ever went to, and yet I have paid more taxes to this country than most of my teachers ever did. And it was a good investment. And good, simple common sense says a country has to find a way to make a major investment in the education of its citizenry, whether they be young or old. That the tools of competition in today's world have to be shared with all of our citizens. But those are lessons that we still struggle with. And we find America slowly but surely trying to abandon its commitment to public education, to the education of all of our children. And instead, we want to give special attention to those who already have the most privileges and ignore and neglect, to our peril, I might say, those who are less fortunate. Not only is that morally wrong, but it's not good economics or just plain good sense. And yet that's where America was at the time of Martin Luther King's death, and I'm afraid that's where we still are. We learned many of the lessons that he shared with us on racism. And I think we've made enormous progress on the race question in spite of the fact that we still have difficulties. I was in one of our nation's greatest hospitals, and I was commiserating with two young men who were talking about the fact that they still experienced racism in this wonderful hospital. And they were talking about their incidents and the snubs and the difficulties that they have, and they made the mistake of saying, things are no better now than they were 30 years ago. I said, wait a minute. Both of them happen to be from Alabama. one of them from Huntsville and one of them from Montgomery. And I said, 30 years ago, one was a distinguished cardiovascular surgeon, and the other was assistant dean of residency at the medical school. Two prominent black physicians. And I said, when you get in your Porsche and drive out on Chesapeake Bay to your condominium that overlooks your yacht in the marina, remember that 30 years ago, the only thing you could have done in this hospital was shine shoes or empty bedpans. And while you still have problems, don't say that things are just like they were 30 years ago. We've come a long, long way, even though there's still problems. When I was ambassador to the United Nations, I used to take these kinds of gestures as messages from God to keep me humble, because I was living on the 42nd floor of the Waldorf Astoria, and I had my own limousine, and when I got ready to go around the world, they sent my own plane to fly me, and I was meeting with the prime ministers and presidents of all of the countries of the world, and I was pretty important. Everything I said, they made a headline of it in the newspaper. But coming down out of the Waldorf Astoria one day and cutting through the parking lot, and the Waldorf Astoria didn't even have black folk parking cars. But a brother drove up with a big Texas hat on and his big Lincoln Continental, and I was the only thing black he saw. And he turned around and handed me the keys to park his car. And I was the United States ambassador to the United Nations. But as far as he was concerned, I was just another nigger. And my job, if I was walking through the parking lot, had to be parking cars. And I always took those kinds of experiences as reminders that I would never be free until race and creed were no longer a stigma for any human being in these United States. But as much progress as we've made, those incidents still occur, and the problem we have with our children, unfortunately, is we didn't prepare our children for them. I was prepared from the time I was 2 years old to understand racism, to understand that anybody that thought that white people were better than black people was confused and sick, and you didn't get mad with sick and insecure people. You prayed for them and you tried to teach them. And it didn't matter that you were 3 years old and they were 30. They just didn't know any better. And all of my life, I was trained by my parents to deal with people with racism. I guess we kind of thought, after going to jail and marching all across the South, that our children wouldn't have a lot of those problems. And so I must confess that we prepared our children far less than our parents prepared us. And a lot of the anger and hostility and bitterness that we see in the younger generation is not because things are worse, but because somehow we naively thought that they could be perfect in our lifetime. My father told me all from the day I was 4 or 5 years old, you don't get mad in a fight. I grew up at the time of Joe Louis. If you lose your temper in a fight, you lose your fight. Don't get mad, get smart. You have to think your way through a fight. And anger was something for weak people. Strong men didn't get mad. Strong men thought and analyzed and calculated. And unfortunately, present generations have not been as well prepared as former generations were, and so we don't have the kind of commitment to work with difficult situations that, say, an Arthur Ashe had, or a Jackie Robinson had. Shaquille O'Neal and Deion Sanders would think they were crazy. They just want the money, honey. And Charles Barkley can act anyway. He doesn't want to be a role model. He just wants to play game. You know, it wasn't that way. There was a sense of responsibility for everybody. First, there was responsibility for the race, but there was responsibility for the nation, and there was responsibility to God to make the world a better place. And those values, that commitment to the improvement of the human condition, is one of the things that we lost in our quest for material success and political power. And so our nation still hungers and still stumbles because it cannot yet deal with the imperfections in our society. It can't deal with poverty. And so we would deny it and bury it and ignore it. And we would punish the victims of poverty as though further punishment will help them to do something that on their own, that nobody else in America has done on their own. There was a GI Bill, there was a land-grant college, there was all kind of government subsidy. When my wife went to school in New York, tuition at Queens College was $31 a semester. And you could get a master's degree or PhD for $31 a semester. That was a great investment. And everybody that got those degrees has served our nation well and paid back the nation 1,000 times over. And yet all of a sudden there seems to be a tendency in many places to close the doors on education and to kick people off of welfare. Well, if you kick people off of welfare, you put them out into the quote-unquote informal economy, which is pushing drugs or prostitution. I think we'll find that that's a whole lot more expensive than welfare. And then you're going to take young men and not give them any training, no job opportunity, no support system. You're just going to bully them into jail, 3 strikes and you're out. At the same time, you've got a society that insists on its right to have assault weapons in the hand of everybody. It's not going to be long before you're going to start pushing some of these folk out of jail because it's so crowded and they're going to be meaner and more hostile than ever before. And they're going to go pick up these assault rifles. And it seems as though this sort of contract with America is really a contract on America, not intended by the Republican Party. But essentially, if you look at the consequences of all of these actions, and you bring a lot of mean, untrained young people out into the society where the power structure is established by drug lords and where guns are available for everybody, it seems as though they're orchestrating a revolution more powerful than anything communism ever conceived. And there's got to be another way. We've got to go back right to where we were on April 4th, 1968, when Martin Luther King was saying to America, it's time that we wiped out poverty. It's time that we found a way to extend to each and every American citizen all of the rights and privileges and responsibilities that are available to any of the rest of us. Because none of us has been responsible for how and where we were born. We might well have been born by the side of the road in Rwanda. We might well have been the children of parents in Ethiopia or Bangladesh. And yet we who have been given so much in this society and who have been so blessed by our American citizenship, if nothing else, And then when you add to that the blessings of love and the religious values that have come to us out of the heritage of this nation, we are amongst those people on this world, on this planet, the ones that have been most abundantly endowed with wealth and opportunity. And my Bible, I wonder what Bible sometimes the religious right reads, but my Bible says, to them to whom much has been given, of them will much be required. And that somehow those of us who are privileged have the moral obligation, and I think the practical necessity, to see to it that every citizen becomes a full-fledged American citizen. And you know, I even found out it doesn't even require education all the time. Not that everybody doesn't need education, but when our country was at war, we took people out of the fields, and in a matter of few weeks, we had them building airplanes and ships. We took women out of the kitchen, and we made them Rosie the Riveter. When we started buying these Mercedes and Volkswagens from Germany, and the German economy was low on manpower, they imported workers from Turkey that couldn't even read and write in Turkish, and trained them to work in Mercedes and Volkswagen plants because they needed workers. That an economy that's geared toward export and toward meeting a global market is going to require a workforce that is productive. And even when that workforce can't read and write in any language, the Germans found a way to make illiterate Turks productive in highly automated plants, just as in Franklin Roosevelt's time and in the time of the Second World War. We found ways to make every American citizen productive in the war effort, whether it was on the battlefield or in the defense plants. And when that becomes a priority, I think our nation has the resources and the intelligence to meet those needs. We did some things like that in Atlanta, and I'll just tell you about one or two of them, because we just decided that everybody had to have an equal opportunity. There was a company that wanted to build an amphitheater, and the tendency is to take the amphitheater way out in the suburbs, where nobody but people with automobiles can get to it. And we couldn't find any land in our suburbs that wasn't already, because we were in the midst of a boom. And so I offered them some land in the central city, right down near Carver Homes, one of our largest public housing projects. And everybody said, you can't put an amphitheater there where middle-class people, black and white, are going to come into that community in the midst of that poverty, and the crime rate is too high, the illegitimacy is too great, there's too much in the way of drug traffic, there's no way you can police it. I said, I think we can. And we finally got the Music Corporation of America to be willing to run the risk with us. First thing we did was go out into the community and organize some of the young, unemployed young men, put them in a training program, and they became a security company. And we gave them 35% of the contract on the security of the property. We hired a black contractor to be the lead contractor in construction, on the condition that he would go out and recruit some additional young people from the community and train them to work on the construction. The women of the community, we organized into a concessions company. And so instead of just cooking the hot dogs and making the popcorn, they owned the company. And they had a percentage of the concessions contract. Elderly men who were too old old and slow for construction work or for security work, we formed into a company and gave them a percentage, 35% of the parking rights. Everybody in the community had a stake in capitalism. We didn't check anybody's grades. We didn't check anybody's education. Their integrity, their diligence, their reputation in the community was what got them the job. That facility has been operating now in Atlanta, in the heart of one of our poorest neighborhoods, and I don't believe we've ever had an incident. People don't steal cars. Thousands of white kids and middle-class blacks come in paying $25, $30 a ticket to hear these loud rock bands, and they don't smoke dope outside because the community said, this is our facility. We get a percentage of every dollar spent here. We want to keep it working, and we don't want any incidents. We want you to respect our community, and you come in here and we'll respect you. When capitalism includes everybody, it's amazing how well it works. Now, the Atlanta Braves, God bless them, didn't learn that lesson. They don't even want to sign contracts with baseball players as a group, but they would not include the community in the ownership of parking and concessions in the same way. They have to pay our police force $35 an hour overtime. For every Braves game, you got 150, 200 policemen out there trying to keep that community safe. And I don't think there's a single night when somebody doesn't lose their radio or their tires or their battery or their car or their wallet, that when you try to use military means to secure wealth in the midst of poverty, it's a failure. When you allow the poor to be a part of the flourishing of capitalist opportunity in the midst of their own community, it's an overwhelming success. Now, some people would call that affirmative action, and they would say that we went out of our way to give somebody an opportunity who wasn't qualified. Well, I don't know whether they were qualified or not. They are doing a better job than anybody else has ever done in that kind of situation, and I will put that facility up against any other outdoor concert amphitheater anywhere in the country, and I'll say it's as safe, it's as secure, and it is as productive for the community and for the ownership of the record companies that send their artists there. And it just seems to me it's time that we understood that a lot of the people that are against a helping hand to the poor, against affirmative action, are really kind of locked into a Marxist mentality with their conservatism. That it's a Marxist notion that the world is a, one fit pie, set pie, and that in order for the poor to get more, the rich have to have less. That has not been the experience of a free market economy. And blacks and whites in the South is probably the best example. The more money blacks got in the South, the richer whites got. In fact, black income when Martin Luther King rode Stride Toward Freedom in 1958 was $18 billion annually. Black income has gone over $400 billion annually, and the increase has been overwhelmingly in the South. And still, the income gap between blacks and whites tends to widen, in spite of the fact that blacks in America earn more money than all of the wealth of Canada and Mexico combined. We still represent something of a third world nation in the midst of the United States because people don't appreciate the strengths of that market simply because of the color of people's skins. And yet, the overall economy in those areas where blacks have been encouraged and allowed to participate fully is not only better for blacks, it's better for whites as well. And that is because the more people you bring into the free economy, the bigger the pie gets. And you may have a narrower slice, but you've got greater wealth. And with the infusion of white women coming into the workforce, along with the opportunities that are available for black men, we find that white income has grown even faster than black income. But in places where we've tried it, nobody complains. In Atlanta, we have the Olympics. And we have the Olympics in large measure because nobody thought we could get it. And none of the important people were interested, except me. And I always wanted to go to the Olympics. I ran once in the Penn Relays. And that was my last year in college, and I always thought that if I just had a chance, I could have made it. So that's one of my frustrated dreams. And so when somebody talked about bringing the Olympics to Atlanta, I didn't even care. I said, I don't know whether we can get it or not. It'll be fun trying. I couldn't get to the Olympics. Let's see if we can bring the Olympics to me. Well, we went about it black and white together. We went about it Asian and Hispanic together. And the diversity of our community became our greatest asset. In 1987, everybody was sure that the World Cup would be in Miami, and nobody gave Atlanta a snowball's chance in hell of getting the Olympics. And yet Atlanta got the Olympics, and Miami didn't get the World Cup. And part of the difference is that the World Cup was a slam dunk. And so 4 white males went to make the presentation to the World Cup for Miami. And when you look at the politics of the globe, Miami, a city with blacks and Hispanics, and I mean, the mayor of Miami was half Puerto Rican and half French. And for 4 white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males to go to represent Miami was an insult. And FIFA was insulted by it because we took everybody. I mean, there was nobody that we didn't include. The largest investors in Atlanta when I was mayor were the Dutch. So we started out taking the Dutch representatives with us. We had large Japanese investment. We had Chinese, not just restaurants, but trading companies and banks, and we made sure that the Chinese were involved. Coca-Cola's headed by a Hispanic. The largest engineering company in Atlanta was headed by an Indian. And there's 6 votes on the Olympic Committee from the Indian subcontinent. When I took one of the African delegates into the Marriott Marquis and introduced him to the manager there, he said, "Oh my God," and I thought he was impressed with the big fancy hotel, and he said, "He looks just like my friend in the Congo." I said, "Yeah, what's so unusual about that? Everybody in the Congo looks like somebody I know on Auburn Avenue." But we made a linkage with the world, and we won the Olympics. And about 39% of all of the money we're spending with minority contractors. And everybody is sharing in the blessings of the Olympics. One little fellow from the country came in and he was printing T-shirts. And nobody thought we had a chance to win the Olympics, so nobody else was printing T-shirts. But he had just gotten a contract with the Braves to help them print them some T-shirts, so he'd gone into debt and bought a fancy piece of equipment. And everybody thought he was crazy until we won the Olympics, and nobody else could print those Olympic T-shirts but him. And he was printing 20,000 a day. He cleared $1 million a month for the first 6 months. He brought all of his kinfolk from down in Fort Valley, in Peach County, all of them were in there working in that factory, and they ran that machine 24 hours a day. And if you got an Olympic t-shirt, it was probably printed by some black country folk that didn't have higher education, but they had access to capital, they had access to opportunity, and they were full participants in the growth and development of the Olympic dream, politically, culturally, and financially. It seems to me that that's what Martin Luther King was trying to get America to see. I think we're doing it to some extent in Atlanta, but I think our nation doesn't understand it. And even though my good friend Newt Gingrich is the congressman from the next congressional district to the one I served, and everything in his district came from the government, it's the most highly subsidized congressional district in America. And if he practiced what he preached in his district, he would be run out of office immediately. But after his district has received all of the government subsidies, all of the government contracts for Lockheed, and freeloading on Atlanta, they're doing pretty good. But that's where we are. It's almost as though, as a nation, we are still in 1995 on April the 4th, just as we were when Martin Luther King was taken from us. Not that we haven't made enormous progress, not that the world is not a different place, but in terms of dealing with the problems of poverty, we have slipped a little backwards. So far that even black folk, who now are the beneficiaries of the progress that we've made on race, and who went to colleges during the times when affirmative action was perceived by the universities as a national priority. And you get some of them even now in the Supreme Court saying that they don't believe in the very thing that got them out of Pinpoint, Georgia. And so it's a time of confusion, but it's a time, I think, when we as a nation must pull together and take up where Martin Luther King left off. And I don't know how we're going to do it, but as I sat there watching Martin Luther King, knowing that he had gone on to glory to attain a well-deserved reward, and even wishing that I could have gone with him, or that I could have gone instead of him, that we still can make progress in 1995 as we have from 1968 to 1995. When we walked from Selma to Montgomery, I had no idea that I would end up in the Congress or be an ambassador. It was inconceivable for me to think of being mayor of Atlanta, or the idea that the Olympics could come to a southern city. And I don't know how we did any of that. But I know that the same God, the strength and faith of the people, the moral fabric of our laws and of our economy that have allowed us to succeed, haltingly and hesitant though we have, that somehow there is still the capacity in 1995 to complete that job. And as we complete that job for the United States of America, I think we're going to find that we can't do it alone. That we're not going to be able to wipe out poverty in the United States of America unless we help to wipe out poverty in South Africa, unless we can eliminate poverty in the Sudan and Ethiopia. That there is a global reality that almost requires that for any of the world to make sense, all of the world has got to make sense. And I think that's what the 21st century challenges us to find a way to make this whole planet of ours make sense for all of God's children. That's what Martin Luther King gave his life for. That's what I've tried to live for. I think that's the challenge that I would extend to you this evening. For even though we've come a long, long way, we've still got a long, long way to go. And the leadership that you offer is far better prepared than the leadership that brought us this far. And so the future's in your hands and God's hands. And as far as I'm concerned, that's good enough for me. God bless you. If there are any questions or comments, brief ones, I'd be glad to try to respond. Here. Mm-hmm. Well, let me say that affirmative action as it has been practiced has not been perfect, but the feeble attempts at affirmative action have been far more beneficial to the society than not doing it. Every time a black contractor gets a contract, more than likely that means that some black people are going to be employed. If those people are employed, they will care better for their children. They will not be wards of the state. They will be contributing citizens in our society. I just think there's not much to argue about. People try to say that when Martin Luther King said a man should be judged by the content of his character rather than the color of his skin, that he was speaking of a desire for a raceless society. And I would say that he was. But that was the second half of that speech. The first half of that speech, which is almost never quoted, says that America has presented the Negro with a bad check, and that when we took our check to the Bank of Justice, it came back marked insufficient funds. And before we get to the time when there has to be, when there can and should be a simple judging simply by the content of character rather than the color of skin, we have to establish that America is paying off on its bad checks. There's a bad check on education. There's a bad check on health care. I mean, you can argue about it, but black people die quicker than white people. Black people don't get as much educational investment as white people. Black people are denied job opportunity time and time again. When we correct all of that, yes, we want a world where we're judged by the content of our character rather than the color of our skin. But in the meantime, we've got to find a way to collect on that check. I don't think that's, I just think that makes good common sense, that it's better to have people educated and working than in jail and on welfare. Now, if you can find another way to get them educated and working, I'm with that, whatever that is. Yes.
Yes, my name is Tosh Brown, and I'm a member of the first vice president representing the state youth conference of NAACP branches, and I attend Allentown Senior High School. I heard you speak about youth today, and my question concerns that you contrasted the way your generation was raised with the way my generation was raised. I thank God for my church family and for the NAACP's role models I found there that have, lived in the right way. Youth is one of my concerns, and I've engaged in a lot of discussions about the problems with our generation. What I need to know is, okay, we know the problem. What can we do now? What is your opinion on how we can help solve the problems of our generation? What you can do and what I can do.
Yeah.
And
Let me say that I was really talking about my own family, and I was saying that I didn't prepare my children as well to deal with racism as my parents prepared me. That varies from family to family. I think we're playing catch up with our children. With my children, they're doing pretty well now. But it was difficult for them to adjust to a work. They were adjusting to the problems of racism in their later teens in university and law school and in their workplace. They were making adjustments that my parents helped me make when I was 6 and 7 years old. So I was just saying that that's one of the things that I sense about our generation. I want to remind you that when Martin Luther King started, he was 25. When we started Birmingham and Selma, the people who started those movements were all in their teens. And we went there to help them. That wasn't our idea. Selma was not Martin Luther King's idea. Selma was the idea of some teenagers, that it offended them that their parents and teachers didn't have the right to vote. And so they decided to do something about it. We went over to help them. I would say that almost anything young people start, there will be large numbers of adults who will be glad to help them. But I'm afraid that my generation has started all we're going to start. What I'm going to do is keep on doing what I've been doing. And I think I've been doing that fairly well, and I don't know anything else. So I better stick with what I'm doing. But now my son and my daughters disagree with me all the time. And that's the way it should be. And I don't know what they're going to do or what their friends are going to do. My grandchildren will probably do even more in different ways. And so I would just encourage, one, I appreciate the articulate way you have stated the problem. And the fact that you are active in the NAACP youth movement. Let me just, I'm reading Nelson Mandela's autobiography. And that's the way Nelson Mandela started out, in the ANC youth movement. If you read Ralph Bunche's autobiography or Frederick Douglass' autobiography, I would recommend that you do a little reading on other people's, what other people did as young people. I even had a book I wrote I'll give you if you hang around a little while. I couldn't do what Frederick Douglass did. I read W.E.B. Du Bois as a young person, but it missed me. Somehow Gandhi got through. And so we took our clue from Gandhi's nonviolent movement in India. I don't know where your clues to leadership will come from, but I think you're on the right track. And you make it. I don't worry about young people. I mean, for every sorry, trifling failure that I read about in the newspapers, I meet literally thousands of young people that are doing well. In Atlanta, 72% of our public high school students are going on to college. And another 10 to 15% goes into the military. We're missing about somewhere between 5-7% that we lose track of, but most of those that will stick with our education system through high school make it on somewhere. And that's in a school system where 75% of the kids in the school system qualify for free lunch. So it's not a rich school system. And it's 90% black. And so I'm not that worried about young people. And whenever you get a clear sense of direction about what you want to do, I'm sure there will be many people from my generation that will be anxious to help. Mm-hmm.
Several states, including Pennsylvania, are in the process of allowing families to have vouchers so that they can use these vouchers to send their children to private or parochial schools. This is being viewed as an attempt to undermine the effectiveness of public schools and patronize or subsidize parochial schools. What's your opinion with regard to this and what the implications might be for public schools?
Well, I think the implications of vouchers are very, very bad for public schools. It probably means the destruction of public education. To me, it represents an abandonment of the government's responsibility to give everybody basically the same educational start. Now, even as I say that, I'm aware of the fact that public education has gotten pretty stagnant. My mother was a teacher. My mother-in-law was a teacher in a one-room school. She's 91. She was a teacher in a one-room school in Alabama. My daughter is a teacher in a public school in Washington, D.C. My wife taught for 25 years or so in Atlanta. All of them basically are doing the same thing. Anything else that hadn't changed anymore in 75 years than education is out of business. Now, I didn't like school. Even though my mama was a teacher and I married a teacher, I never got along with teachers. Because I always felt like there was a kind of cookie-cutter approach to education. And I frankly felt that growing up in New Orleans, Louisiana, my teachers were trying, if I had listened to my teachers, I'd have been a good nigger staying in my place, down there waiting tables somewhere in a restaurant in New Orleans. I mean, that's what they were training me. They wanted to fit me into that model because that was what the opportunities. If you were really lucky, you got to be a bricklayer or a longshoreman. Or worked in the post office. I mean, that was all of the opportunity available for a black person. So for me to be asking questions and Yeah, I mean, just doing all kinds of devilish things that, I mean, I don't believe the Lord meant for me to keep still, and my teachers wanted me to keep still. And, you know, I don't blame the teachers, but there's something drastically wrong with all education, including university education. I mean, you can get a degree in political science, a PhD, and never organize a block. And what you study about political science is not necessarily related to the way the political process works. You can read, I mean, I never read a single book on African history. I should have maybe. But I mean, I was a biology major in college. But what I learned about the world, I learned from the foreign students on the campus. And I read the books and the novels that they wanted me to read. And I didn't read what Europeans said about Africa or the Caribbean. And I was always getting in trouble with the State Department because the State Department believed what European experts said about the world. And I talked to people from the world. And I talked to missionaries. And the relationship between formal education and reality is one that needs to be re-examined at every level. Now, that's not a criticism so much as it is a prayer. I think our educational system is basically what I've talked about this whole hour. It's the best hope that we've got, but I think it's fallen dreadfully short. That's not just white universities or predominantly white universities. I mean, for a black university like Morehouse College to be in the middle of a poor black community, surrounded by problems of crime and people studying sociology out of a book, doesn't make sense. The sociology is right there and dealing with those kids. Now, fortunately, at Morehouse and Spelman, now they're requiring, part of their requirement for graduation is working with the community and bringing students from the poor neighborhoods surrounding the college on the campus and starting them in 6th grade tutorials and things like that, and relating the community, the poor community, to the university. But there's a lot that we have to do. There's no business around those black universities. And see, they didn't teach us about business. We were brought up to be a part of the talented 10th. We were supposed to be teachers and doctors and lawyers and nurses and social workers. We weren't trained to make money. And so there's not much of a business tradition in much of the black community. There's more in the South than there is in the North, I think, sometimes. But the business tradition, I mean, Ethiopians came into Atlanta from starvation. And now they're probably some of the wealthiest people in Atlanta. I mean, they were starving 20 years ago when the Ethiopian famine. They went to work in parking lots and restaurants, and they came up because there was a business tradition in Ethiopia. And the Ethiopian community, when I ran for mayor, I'd go to the Ethiopian community to get contributions because they got plenty of money. But 20 years ago, they came there as starving refugees. West Indians coming to the United States have done sometimes much better than Southern blacks for the same reason. You see, we were not only locked out of education and politics, but we were locked out of capitalism. And we were locked out of capitalism to some extent by black educational and religious institutions. I mean, as much money, and I'm a preacher, as much money that goes through our churches, we have seldom, if ever, thought of our churches as economic institutions. And yet the key to Atlanta's success is that the churches got together and started their own insurance company, an Atlanta Life Insurance Company. There's a black bank in Atlanta that's almost 100 years old. It was founded by the churches. All of the churches putting their money in the same bank. Then when black folk wanted to build housing developments, they went to the black bank to borrow money. So we got better housing than most people, than most cities for blacks in Atlanta. But a lot of that was because 75 years ago, the churches got economically involved in the development of the community. And so almost every institution, I think, is going to have to undergo some overhaul and upheaval. Your question, public education, we need to do it. We need to change. One of the things that vouchers will do, and I hope that people, see, the best school I've ever seen, the kind of school I wish I'd gone to, was a school for drug addicts and prostitutes in New York City. And the reason was that it was formed by two young people with PhDs. And it was funded by back when John Lindsay was mayor. And nobody wanted to deal with these students. So they put together a curriculum where every class had a psychologist and a history teacher, a psychologist and a math teacher, a psychologist and a, shop teacher, whatever they were taking. But every course spent some time talking about the emotional condition of the students, and they developed the curriculum out of the emotional needs of the students. And they took young people who were drug addicts and prostitutes in their early teens, and they got them together and sent them to college, and many of them went on to be very, very successful. It was called the Alpha School. That was a public school. The Cities and Schools movement that takes that takes dropouts, right now in Atlanta is run by the public school system. But the teachers there are there with a little extra religious motivation, and it's perceived as an alternative school. My oldest daughter was about to quit school, and I put her in one of these alternative public schools because she was so tired and bored with high school. And they let her read Shakespeare, and they got her a job as a reporter's apprentice with the newspaper, and they set up a political science reading program for her and let her study almost what she wanted to study for a year and a half or 2 years. She got a scholarship to Swarthmore and went on through law school and everything else, and is the brain in the family now. But at 15, we were about to lose her in a traditional middle-class black public school. We're still trying to win my son back because schools turn him off so bad. So there are real problems in schools, and schools cannot remain the same and survive. But it doesn't mean that we don't. I think the society can't be the America that Jefferson and Lincoln and the founding fathers talked about unless we have equal opportunity in a public system of education and virtually a common curriculum. See, it used to be the public schools and the military that made us one nation. We did away with the draft. And say what you want about the Army, and I didn't like the Army, and I was a pacifist and anti-military, but when it comes to human relations, the Army did a better job than the universities, than the church or business. Because you couldn't give people guns who were different colors and have them stand side by side unless you taught them to relate to their cultural differences. So the required by the military was a race relations course as part of basic training. I still don't know whether most of our universities require basic race relations, cultural diversity, something to help us understand and appreciate the differences ought to be a part of the first 6 weeks of school. I don't know about how it is here, but black folk and white folk on the same college campuses and don't speak to each other. You go into the average cafeteria and all the black students at one table and all the white students at other tables. I mean, that's okay, but that's not education. Education is understanding differences. Education, I mean, the daughter that went to Swarthmore, I went up there and she's sitting up there with all the black folk. I said, you know black folk. If you're going to learn about the world, you better learn to understand white folk. And these white folk got money too. If you want some money, get to know some of them. But I mean, we got a lot of work to do with our society, and I don't think vouchers help us, but maybe it will shake us up to change education a little bit, a lot. Mm-hmm.
I'm one of these individuals with about 30 to 40 nieces and nephews. And as black professionals, I wonder what kind of grade do you give us as you've observed over the last 30 years, 27?
Well, I tend to be extremely tolerant of everybody. I really think that everybody does the best that they can do. I mean, there are very few people that wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to screw up today. I mean, we really try to do our best. And I mean, I got lots of nephews and nieces, and I'm always guilty because I can't spend enough time with them. To give them the help that they need. I do try to visit their schools when they're in trouble. I try to go get them out of jail when they go to jail. And, black folk don't go to jail because they're bad. Black folk go to jail because they're uppity. I mean, if you're not willing to kowtow and humiliate yourself before a policeman, you get locked up. Now, the reason I told you to read Mandela is that Mandela learned how to deal with racist policemen that wanted to get him upset as an excuse to kill him. And he never let them drag him down to their level. We've got to do a lot more in character education. We were taught to fight. We were taught to not take anything from anybody. We were sort of taught in the 60s and 70s that being free meant being bad, B-A-A-D. Don't take no crap off nobody. And that's not civilized. Jackie Robinson, Arthur Ashe, Grant Hill, it seems to me, Michael Jordan, represent a kind of role model. Arthur Ashe, because Arthur Ashe invested every dollar he made. Arthur Ashe didn't have a car or a suit for 20 years. And he'd been making over $1 million a year, but he invested it. You're never going to have money working for money. You're only going to have money when you get money working for you. And we give our professional athletes make all this money and they throw it all away and they're 35 and 40 and broke. That's not intelligent. And I don't think we've done enough to portray the values that made us successful. The values that made us successful were those old-fashioned Christian work ethic values. And most of us, because we had worked so hard and caught so much hell from society and from our parents and everything else, most of us, let's confess it, spoiled our children. Now, maybe that's all right to some extent. But it doesn't prepare them for life as well as they need to be prepared. I don't think you're supposed to enjoy life. I enjoy it, but you're supposed to serve and do some good for somebody else. And if you're doing good for somebody else, you'll be happy. If you're going around here trying to be happy by having a certain kind of coat and a certain kind of tennis shoes, you miss the point. You know, I swear we used to jump just as high in 295 Converse as they do in Air Jordans. And I know we used to run faster because can't anybody run anymore. But, you know, we've gotten with our little material success, we have let our children have too much emphasis on the material side of life, and we've neglected the lessons that really made us successful insofar as we're successful. I mean, I'm successful in large measure because my grandmama was blind. And my grandmama required that I read the Bible to her every day. And I had to read the newspaper and the Bible. And I couldn't go out to play. I couldn't do anything till she had read the Bible and the newspaper. And, you know, that's where I got my education and my values. Now we put blind people in homes. Or we've moved away and leave them down south or up north or somewhere else. We don't have old folk in the house to help us. I mean, the value lessons are very seldom, if anthropologists analyze societies, the value lessons in a society are always provided by the elders. Welfare, migration cut us off from the elders. And so we don't have anybody sharing values sufficiently. And we've got to put together that value society again. But we're doing as well as we know how. And we're going to even do better. Thank you very much.